He merely uttered a few words critical of Nazi Germany, and as a result, he became the target of the Gestapo's round-the-clock manhunt. No matter where he fled, the Gestapo always seemed to track him down in an instant. To evade capture, a desperate Hans finally resolved to flee his homeland where he'd lived for years with his son. Father and son mingled among a group of Jews persecuted by Nazi Germany, planning to sneak across the border under cover of night, but they were still spotted by German troops. Alert! He immediately took his son and scrambled up a tree. Hidden by the darkness, the two weren't detected, but the other Jews, scattering in panic, were all shot dead by the Germans. A week later, Hans and his son began a new life in a small town in eastern France. The kind-hearted Paul looked after them well. Tensions between Germany and France were already strained over the situation, so to avoid unnecessary trouble, Hans lied about being Belgian. When his son asked when they could go home, when they could visit grandma, Hans fell into deep silence. He knew that the moment they left their homeland, it meant there was no longer a place for them there. The idea of returning someday was nothing but self-comfort, a distant, unattainable dream. Though Hans was a displaced refugee, he unexpectedly found true love in the town. A young, beautiful schoolteacher in the town was drawn to Hans' kindness and calm demeanor. Hans, perceptive, saw her feelings clearly, but he knew he might not stay long in the town, that he couldn't offer her a quiet, stable life, so he averted his eyes from her warm gaze, choosing to ignore it. A month later, France declared war on Germany. One night, Hans was arrested by French police for concealing his German identity. The police, suspecting him of being a German spy, threw him in prison. It wasn't until 8 months later, one morning, that the French police frantically unlocked all the cell doors. Hans regained his freedom. Confused, he rushed out of the prison to find the city sky swarming with German warplanes, bombs raining down, deadly bullets flying toward them. Fleeing, he stumbled upon a tunnel and, panicking, jumped in without hesitation, but no sooner had he entered than a group of British soldiers pointed their guns at his head. Hans immediately screamed repeatedly that he was Belgian. At that moment, a soldier ran to report that German troops had entered the tunnel from the other end of the town hall. Upon hearing this, Percy, no longer interested in questioning Hans, led his team in a hasty retreat. Hans quickly got up and followed the British, running as hard as he could. Soon, they spotted German soldiers in the tunnel, but the British didn't fire. They only wanted to escape the terrifying, danger-filled tunnel swarming with Germans. Percy led the group through the tunnel, evading Germans while racing toward the exit. Hans followed, but just as they neared the exit, they came under heavy attack from the Germans. Though the ambushed British fought back fiercely, they were ultimately wiped out. Only Percy and Hans, at the rear, survived by luck. Percy had no choice but to take Hans to find another exit. They hadn't gone far when they suddenly heard German voices nearby. As a German speaker, Hans understood the language and gleaned information from their conversation, allowing them to avoid the Germans' search route and reach the exit. They then ran for their lives, finally escaping the dark, terrifying tunnel. But barely out of the tunnel, Percy raised his gun and aimed it at Hans' head. Percy suspected he was a German spy because in the tunnel, Hans had used the Germans' conversation to determine their search direction, helping Percy evade them. Desperate, Hans admitted he wasn't Belgian but German, a German being hunted by the Nazi Gestapo. Looking at Hans' sincere face, and recalling that without him, he might not have escaped the tunnel, Percy, half convinced, slowly lowered his gun, choosing to trust Hans for the time being. The two set off together, embarking on a long journey of escape. They trekked all day, and by evening, Hans, away from home for over 8 months, finally returned to the small town where he'd lived. He rushed home to find his long-missed son, but after searching everywhere, there was no sign of him. Not only was Hans' son gone, but the entire town was empty. Not a soul in sight. A sense of foreboding instantly gripped every fiber of Hans' being. He hurried to Paul's house, hoping to find clues, but Paul's house was also deserted. In his anxious despair, he suddenly heard a noise behind him. Spinning around, he saw a man holding a gun standing not far away. The man with the gun was Paul's neighbor. From him, Hans learned that to escape the war, Paul had led everyone in the town westward to evacuate. The man, reluctant to leave his cherished collection of fine wines, had spent the day before evacuation drinking as much as he could to minimize his loss. Drunk, he slept until noon the next day. Missing Paul's evacuation, the man told Hans, "Your son is probably with the evacuees, but I don't know where they've gone." Hans felt a mix of joy and worry. Joy, because he knew his son wasn't alone. Worry, because he had no idea where Paul had taken him. The next morning, he rushed to Paul's office, rummaging through everything to find the evacuation destination, but he found nothing. He then went to the town school, and in the classroom, luck smiled on him. He saw a message his son had left on the blackboard. At the sight of those words, the tension in Hans' chest finally eased a little. Just then, Percy spotted 2 German soldiers not far from the town. Looking around, in the next second, the soldiers mounted their motorcycle and sped toward the town. Panicked, Percy grabbed his gun, scrambled away from the pasture, and went to find Hans. Hans, having just returned, heard that German soldiers were approaching quickly. Without a word, he followed Percy into hiding. Percy wanted to ambush the 2 soldiers to avenge his fallen comrades, but Hans stopped him. Hans only wanted to survive and find his son. Begged by Hans, Percy abandoned the idea. The 2 German soldiers were scouts, originally coming to the pasture to find water, but they unexpectedly found the British cigarette pack Percy had dropped there the day before. The pack suggested British soldiers might be hiding nearby. Alert! They glanced toward the house where Hans and Percy were hiding. To avoid suspicion, they said nothing, pretending nonchalance as they took out their radio to report to their unit. But the other soldier thought reporting British presence based solely on a cigarette pack seemed imprudent, so they put on their helmets, loaded their guns, and rushed toward the house to investigate up close. They inched toward the house, then slowly peeked around only to find the area empty and eerily quiet. Though no British soldiers were visible, they proceeded cautiously, each dash feeling like a race against death. Lethal bullets could fly toward them at any moment. The newly enlisted German soldier, still panicked, urged his comrade to call for backup, but his stubborn comrade insisted on searching further. With that, the comrade sprinted toward the house's front door. The German soldier watched, distraught and panicked, as his comrade walked inside. Soon, he heard a gunshot from the house, then saw his comrade, screaming, being thrown from the second floor, landing motionless on a haystack. Sharp enough to know his comrade was dead, he grew even more panicked, gasping for breath as he struggled to calm himself. Then he summoned the courage to flee. He ran as fast as he could toward the distant motorcycle, but no sooner had he stood than Percy burst from the house, chasing him and seizing the chance to shoot him dead. Percy then rushed to check the bodies. Hans, too, followed with his pistol. Just then, the radio the Germans had left on suddenly crackled to life. Hans, being German, quickly picked it up and reported to the German unit that all was well. His fluent German didn't arouse suspicion. As soon as he finished, the man who'd missed the evacuation due to drinking whom they'd met in the village returned from outside. The man had planned to stay in the town alone, but seeing the German corpses on the ground, he knew it was no longer safe. Persuaded by Hans, he finally decided to leave with them. The 3 set off westward on the 2 German scouts' motorcycle. After traveling for what seemed like ages, they reached a deserted town, emptied by people fleeing the war. By then, the motorcycle had run out of fuel, so they split up to find more. Percy soon located a garage, where he luckily found fuel, but before he could smile, Hans ran over to say German troops were in the town. No sooner had Hans spoken than the rumble of German vehicles came from outside the window behind Percy. The 2 hurried to the window. Dozens of German soldiers were jumping off military trucks. Fortunately, the Germans didn't seem to be hunting them. They marched straight to the square to assemble. Then, from their hiding spot, Percy and Hans watched a German cameraman filming with a movie camera. It turned out the Germans were making a propaganda film, framing their invasion of France as a liberation. They'd brought in a group of captured colonial soldiers, planning to have them, on camera, voluntarily pick up guns and join the German army to fight their former colonial masters, supposedly proving how popular Germany's liberation of France was. With that, several German soldiers placed guns loaded with blanks in front of the prisoners, but no matter how the Germans propagandized, the soldiers stood frozen like wooden stakes. Witnessing this, the German troops brought over a French civilian they had just captured by chance in the town, and this civilian was none other than the companion of Hans and Percy. Seeing their comrade taken prisoner, the 2 were seized by a gnawing sense of anxiety, but being outnumbered, they could only hide by the window and silently pray that their companion would safely escape this disaster. However, in the next second, the Germans, wanting to make an example of him, shot Hans' companion dead right in front of the soldiers. Watching his companion being killed and being powerless to do anything, Hans was filled with guilt. It was he who had persuaded his companion to flee with him. If it weren't for his persuasion, perhaps his companion would still be living safely in the town at this moment, and the prisoners were completely overwhelmed by the sound of this gunshot. Everyone hurriedly got up to pick up the weapons on the ground and voluntarily joined the German army. Shortly after, the German troops, together with the soldiers, began to search the town, to avoid being discovered by the German troops. Hans and Percy quickly fled the town in a hurry. In this way, the two started to continue their westward escape on foot, since the Anglo-French Allied forces were suffering successive defeats on the front line at this time. Along their way, there were abandoned luggage and belongings of fleeing civilians everywhere. Looking at the messy scene all over the ground, Hans couldn't help but start worrying about his son who was fleeing westward with Paul. Just then, Hans suddenly saw a familiar red car in the distance. The moment he approached the car, he was completely panic-stricken, because what was in front of him was exactly Paul's red car, and his son had been fleeing westward with Paul. Looking at the dilapidated car in front of him, the thought that his son might have met with misfortune instantly overwhelmed Hans, making him unable to breathe. He rummaged through the car like crazy, and soon he found his son's backpack in the carriage. At the sight of his son's backpack, Hans was in complete despair, and near the red car, he also saw a dozen newly buried graves. With his sharpness, he knew that the people in these graves were very likely related to the attacked red car. These graves might contain his son, whom he had been searching for so hard. He hesitated for a long time, and finally bent down to start digging the graves with all his strength, because he had to make sure whether his son was still alive. Every time he dug a grave, Hans had to summon up great courage, for he was afraid that he would see that familiar face. Fortunately, he dug all the graves, and in the end, he didn't see his son. Percy, who was traveling with him, also ran over to comfort him, saying that his son must be safe and sound somewhere, waiting for him. In the evening, Hans and his companion accidentally encountered a French army unit that was building defensive positions. Percy, who had been traveling with Hans all the way, chose to stay and fight with this French army unit. Hans said goodbye to Percy in this way and began to continue his westward journey alone to find his son. The next morning, Hans accidentally passed by a cemetery. Somehow, at the sight of the cemetery, Hans couldn't help but think of his son, whose life or death was unknown at this moment. This kind of great suffering suppressed in his heart is something that people who have never experienced it can never understand. Finally, physically and mentally exhausted, Hans slowly collapsed on the grass. Before long, a child suddenly appeared beside Hans. It turned out that one late night not long ago, Suzanne, who was sound asleep, suddenly heard the cry of a man's son. She immediately got up and ran to the man's room. She opened the door slowly and saw the man's son sitting on the bed crying loudly. It turned out that France had declared war on Germany at this moment, and the man had just been arrested and imprisoned by the police because he deliberately concealed his German identity. Looking at Max, who was crying helplessly on the bed, Suzanne secretly made up her mind to help Hans, whom she loved, take good care of this helpless child in front of her. Time flew by, and 8 months passed quickly. One morning, Paul suddenly asked everyone to gather in the square. Just when everyone was curious about what major event had happened, Paul finally came out slowly. He stood on a high place and told everyone with great helplessness that the German troops had broken through the border and launched an invasion war against them. The government informed them that all the townspeople would follow him to move westward to avoid the war the next morning. Hearing this news, everyone's faces were instantly filled with panic and confusion, because moving westward would mean that they had to give up all their land and the family property accumulated over the years. What's more, it's hard to leave one's native land, and no one is willing to be a displaced refugee. But in the face of war, what else can they do as ordinary people except flee? To escape, some people released all their livestock, and some people couldn't bear to part with all kinds of fine wines they had collected for many years, so they tried their best to drink the wine into their stomachs. And Suzanne was faced with a tricky problem, because Max was unwilling to flee westward with her. Max insisted on staying in the town to wait for his father, and he believed that his father would definitely come back to him. But how could Suzanne have the heart to leave Max alone in the town, especially since he was the child of Hans, whom she loved? To take Max out of the town, she asked Max to write a message to his father on the blackboard, explaining clearly the time they left and the destination of this trip. Coupled with her painstaking persuasion, Max was willing to leave the town with her. Early the next morning, Paul left the home where he had lived for many years slowly with his luggage and family property. At this moment, all the people were already waiting in front of Paul's house, ready to flee westward with him, to ensure that everyone could reach the destination smoothly. Before setting off, Paul read out the escape rules to everyone, such as not leaving the team without permission and having to obey Paul's command on the way to escape. Then, everyone followed Paul and started the long and arduous journey of escape. At this moment, everyone's hearts were in a turmoil, with mixed feelings, because they knew that after leaving this time, they didn't know when they would be able to come back. Moreover, Even if they were lucky enough to come back one day, their beautiful home would probably have already become a ruin by then, and this long and arduous escape journey might also be faced with all kinds of unpredictable dangers and hardships. But driven by the tides of the era, they could only flee westward with all their might, helpless and desperately. Suzanne, with Max in the crowd, was also full of sadness. What made her most sad was not leaving her home, but not knowing if she could meet Hans, whom she loved, again. After walking for 4 hours, they were about to merge into the main road, but Paul was worried that the main road might be extremely congested at this moment, so he hoped that Suzanne would ride a bicycle to scout the way first. Suzanne had always obeyed Paul's words, because for Suzanne, Paul was not just Paul, but more like a father who had always cared for her. Suzanne rode her bicycle all the way, and soon came near the main road. She looked from a distance and saw that the entire main road was crowded with fleeing people, with no end in sight. In this case, if their escape team merged into the main road, they would definitely be scattered by the crowd. Moreover, there were many people on the main road, and if someone robbed food or made trouble, they would also face unnecessary harm. So Paul gathered the backbone of the town and held an emergency meeting. Finally, everyone unanimously decided to continue along the path and not enter the crowded main road. When Suzanne rode her bicycle at the front again to scout the way for the escape team, she saw a scene that she would never forget at a road junction. This was the first time that the kind-hearted Suzanne saw the real face of war. Terror, panic, helplessness and despair instantly filled every cell of Suzanne's body. She immediately rushed back quickly and stopped the fleeing crowd that was moving forward. She pointed out another detour, which was not easy to walk, to Paul, who was leading the way, because she didn't want everyone to see the cruel scene she had just seen, especially the innocent children in the escape team. Then, as a teacher, she called all the children to gather around her. Although Suzanne's abnormal behavior made everyone a little confused, the sharp Paul believed that Suzanne must have her own reasons for doing so. Paul had always regarded Suzanne as his own daughter, so he trusted Suzanne. In this way, Paul led the escape team onto the not-so-easy path that Suzanne had just pointed out, and Suzanne gathered all the children on a carriage, trying every means to attract the children's attention. Before long, everyone saw what Suzanne had just seen on the other road. Looking at the tragic scene in front of him, Paul finally understood Suzanne's good intentions. At this moment, everyone's mood was extremely heavy, because they knew that the tragedy they saw could happen to themselves at any time. However, the only thing that comforted them was that Suzanne had done her best to protect the innocence and happiness of their children just now, although they were already in the whirlpool of war. Looking at the bright smiles on the faces of the protected children, it more or less brought a little spiritual comfort to these melancholy parents. In the afternoon of the next day, their escape team passed through a small town. Looking at the residents sitting in front of their homes who were about to flee and the messages left for their families on the wooden doors, the scene in front of them couldn't help but add a little more melancholy to everyone's hearts. Paul's team continued to flee westward like this for many days, and their food was already running out. One morning, they arrived at a small town where the people were packing up their things and preparing to flee. Paul also decided to replenish some food for everyone here. He walked into the store quickly, only to find that the prices of all the food had risen to an unacceptable level. He discussed with the boss with a kind face, asking if the price could be cheaper, because the current price had exceeded their affordability. As a result, the boss's wife said indifferently that they were not forcing him to buy their things. The boss then said that it was free trade and free to buy or sell. Helpless, Paul had to get up and leave. Immediately after, Paul gathered the people who had been fleeing with him all the way to discuss raising funds to buy food. As a result, before the men at the meeting could speak, the women began to shout that they couldn't accept such high food prices, because they would have to continue to live after fleeing to a safe place. If they spent all their money on high-priced food now, how would they live in the future? Paul's wife even said that their selling food at high prices was taking advantage of the war to plunder their property. Since they could plunder us, we could also plunder them. Then she asked everyone to vote by show of hands. Although Paul didn't agree with his wife's words, most people raised their hands in support. Even as the mayor, he was powerless to stop it. Helpless and furious, he stood up and left the meeting. Immediately afterward, the crowd grabbed their shotguns and weapons, and under Paul's wife's leadership, rushed toward the town store. They burst in quickly, then raised their guns at once. Seeing this, the store owner and his wife immediately put their hands up. The crowd then charged into the storage room, quickly hauling all kinds of food out of the store, to prevent conflicts and unnecessary casualties. The kind-hearted Paul followed them to the store. He snapped at the store owner and his wife. If you hadn't jacked up the prices so high, you wouldn't have suffered this loss. Listening to Paul's rebuke, The couple hung their heads in silence, not saying a word. After seizing the food, the group wasted no time fleeing the town, continuing their westward escape. Paul was consumed by guilt over the looting, as was Suzanne, whose heart was equally kind. Not long after the fleeing group left the town, they suddenly heard a rumbling sound from the distant sky. Following the noise, they saw a large fleet of warplanes racing toward them. It was the first time in days since the war began that they'd witnessed such a massive cluster of warplanes streaking overhead. Everyone froze in place, staring at the awe-inspiring spectacle. Just as all the planes had flown past, the last two suddenly turned around, charging toward the stationary crowd. Realizing the danger, people scattered in panic. The planes roared closer, their shrill noise like a hellish scream. Even without firing a shot, merely skimming low overhead, that infernal roar was terrifying enough. After circling once, the planes turned back and unleashed a fierce strafing run. Paul's wife, panicking, floored the car's accelerator, racing to escape, but the planes chased her, firing and bombing until the car crashed into a tree and stalled. Max, cowering in the back, was so terrified his stomach churned. He jumped out and ran for his life. The planes strafed and bombed the fleeing group before banking sharply and departing. Minutes after the planes left, people slowly rose, craning their necks to look around. Over a dozen refugees lay dead from the attack. Regaining her composure, Suzanne hurried to the car only to find Max, who'd been in the back, was gone. She searched frantically nearby, calling his name, but after a long time, there was no sign of him. Finally, persuaded by Paul, a helpless Suzanne had no choice but to follow the group westward. That afternoon, they passed a bridge, where Suzanne saw several French soldiers planting explosives to block the German advance. It was clear the French planned to blow up the bridge. At the sight, Suzanne panicked completely. Back when they'd first set out, she'd sewn their destination and her details into Max's coat just in case he got separated. He could find his way back to her, but if the bridge was destroyed, Max's chance of returning would grow even slimmer. She resolved to turn back and keep searching for him. Yet a few kind French soldiers blocked her path. Paul, who'd always treated Suzanne like a daughter, also ran over, desperate to stop her for her own safety. Helpless, Suzanne could only watch in anguish as the French blew up the bridge. Meanwhile, Max, whom Suzanne was frantic about, wandered lost in the wilderness, staring around, disoriented. He had no idea where he was. As he walked, he suddenly heard someone shouting for help. Following the voice, he found a badly wounded German soldier. Learning Max was German, the soldier handed him his wallet. "The money's yours," he told Max, "but please give the rest to any German soldiers you meet. Ask them to send these things back to my hometown." Before Max could nod in agreement, the dying soldier closed his eyes forever. Max stared at the corpse in silence for a long time, then picked up the wallet and walked on. That night, 8-year-old Max spent his first night alone, terrified. The next morning, he stumbled upon an unconscious man lying on the grass. It was Hans, his father, whom he hadn't seen in over 8 months. At the sight of Max, the exhausted Hans suddenly found strength. He pulled his son tightly into his arms. Father and son, separated for over 8 months, were finally reunited. Max told his father everything about the dying German soldier, and about the message Suzanne had sewn into his coat. After thinking it over, Hans decided to use the ID in the wallet to pose as a German soldier. Following the details on Max's coat, he would find Suzanne, who'd cared for his son so faithfully. Meanwhile, Suzanne sat in Paul's cart, continuing west. Suddenly, they heard a roaring engine behind them. Turning, they saw a vast column of German tanks racing toward them. At the sight of the Germans, all the French refugees with Paul froze in panic. They stood rooted to the spot, staring at the approaching troops. These were the fearsome Germans they'd fled from for days. Yet to their surprise, the Germans paid them no mind. They didn't harm them or even stop to look, just raced past. The refugees gaped in shock. Paul, leading the group, stood dumbfounded as the German tanks rumbled away, his face filled with confusion and helplessness. He'd led them west to escape the Germans, but now the enemy they'd fled from was ahead of them. Was there any point in going on? So Paul gathered everyone to discuss whether to continue west. Some argued that France, great as it was, couldn't fall entirely in just 10 days. They were sure they'd find land still held by French troops. Others thought fleeing was pointless, better to return home and live quietly. Surely the Germans wouldn't harm them if they kept to themselves. In the end, the once united group split. One faction insisted on going west. The other, with Paul, chose to return to their hometown. Suzanne went with Paul, determined to cross back over the river and find Hans' son, who'd gone missing 2 days earlier. That night, They found a bridge to cross the river, but it was occupied by German troops. Paul mustered his courage and led the group onto the bridge, trusting the Germans wouldn't harm them. The Germans looked curious, everyone else was fleeing west, but Paul's group was heading back. Paul hurried to explain, "We believe the German army won't hurt ordinary civilians, so we want to stop fleeing and return home." He pulled out his ID as proof. After checking the papers, the Germans smiled and welcomed them back. Paul and his group then began their journey home. On the bridge, they passed a crowd fleeing west. In times of crisis, people make different choices. No choice was right or wrong, just a bid to survive. Among the westward refugees, Suzanne spotted Hans posing as a German soldier and his son. In that moment, Suzanne hesitated. Follow Paul, who'd cared for her like a father, back to town? Or run to Hans, whom she loved? The struggle tore at her. After a long pause, she chose love over family. She spun around and ran desperately toward Hans. She knew if she missed this chance, she might never see him again. After over 10 months of waiting and sacrifice, Suzanne finally found the love she'd longed for. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.